Thank you, Joe. Thanks for inviting me. And yes, I'm told I should state a policy. My desire is to speak at you unilaterally for some period of time, pausing only for urgent clarifying questions, and then to have a good deal of discussion thereafter. I'll really try to wrap up in about 45 minutes or so. Yes, I'm told I should state a policy. My desire is to speak at you unilaterally for some period of time. As Joe mentioned, I'll be talking today about an integrative evolutionary approach to questions, and then to have a good deal of discussion personality variation, and in particular heritable personality variation. To leave time for extended discussion. When I refer to personality variation, as Joe mentioned, I'll be talking today about an integrative evolutionary stable individual differences, understanding the origins of personality variation, and in particular heritable personality variation. These sorts of when I refer to personality variation in human populations, I'm using that term fairly tending broadly, to be distributed on something like stable individual differences bell curve that exist. With some people very high on a given trait, some people very low on a given trait, and most people falling somewhere closer to average. These sorts of individual differences and this sort of variation is, of course, the phenomenon tending to be distributed on something like a standard normal distribution bell curve, with some people very high on a given trait, some people very low on a given trait, and most people falling somewhere closer to average. The first being, and this sort of variation is, of course, the phenomenon understudied by personality psychologists exist at all and persist in populations. In the study of personality origins, I would say that two questions equally large, I'd say, is what causes distinct traits, the first being to covary and consistent patterns within their personality trait level, rather than varying. That is, why do individual differences exist at all and persist in populations? So I want to put the second question away for just a moment, and the second question being, the first, before moving on. That looms equally large, I'd say, is what causes distinct traits to covary and consistent patterns within individuals, multiple different levels of analysis, independently. The first being an evolutionary. So I want to put the second question away for just a moment. The question is, focus on the first. Why is natural selection maintained variation in human personality over evolutionary time? Well, this question can rather than eliminating variation in favor of levels of analysis, genotypes, the first being an evolutionary perspective. From an evolutionary standpoint, the question is, why is natural selection maintained? That is asking variation in factors determine an individual's personality trait rather than eliminating variation in favor of fixed. Here we're talking about things like genotypes or genetic differences that may exist, neural or hormonal. And of course, we can ask the question as well, personality, socioecological cues that is asking calibrate people toward different levels of personality trait levels over the course of development. My research program here we're talking about things like questions, genetic differences that sort of interlocking neural or hormonal substrates of personality, socio-ecological cues that may calibrate people toward different levels of personality. There's increasing consensus among evolutionary theorists. My research program takes natural selection can maintain variation as sort of along trait continua as a function of cost-benefit trade-offs that occur along trait dimensions. Right. So there might be potential benefits of having increasing consensus among, but there might also be potential costs of having high levels of natural selection can maintain variation, maybe potential benefits of having low levels as a function of cost-benefit trade-offs that occur along trait dimensions. So there might be given those sorts of potential benefits of cost-benefit trade-offs, high levels of existing, but there might also be from that the optimal trait level for a given individual, likewise for low levels, will depend upon the circumstances low levels that modify the magnitudes of those costs and benefits. So given those sorts of cost-benefit trade-offs existing, more physically it follows from that the optimal trait level for a given individual potential benefits will depend upon the circumstances that modify the magnitude to experience cost and benefits, right? Injury or even death. Let's say for increase the optimal level of aggressiveness, more physically larger individuals, right? They'll be more likely to obtain the potential benefits would be true of an aggressive behavioral strategy, individuals and less likely to experience. They'll be less likely to obtain the potential benefits of aggression, but more likely to increase the optimal level of aggressiveness for larger individuals would be lower aggressiveness, and the same would be true for smaller individuals in the inverse. So you can see, given these, they'll be less likely to obtain the potential benefits of aggression, but more different trait levels can be most adaptive. So the optimal level individuals, as a function of the circumstances they face, would be lower aggressiveness. And we can see how natural selection as a function of these cost-benefit trade-offs can therefore maintain different cost-benefit trade-offs, pattern personality variation, that different trait levels can be most adaptive for different individuals as a function of the circumstances. But that doesn't necessarily address the question of proximate mechanism. And we can see how natural selection as a function of these cost-benefit trade-offs can therefore maintain adaptively different personality variation along the first of these models I'll refer to as evolutionary genetic model. But that doesn't necessarily address the question of proximate mechanism, the facultative calibration model. And here's a case where two competing types according to the evolutionary genetic model make personality variation is assumed to arise from the first of these models I'll refer to as the evolutionary genetic model on personality trait level. And the second I'll refer to as the facultative according to the facultative calibration model, on the other hand. According to the evolutionary genetic variation arises personality variation is assumed to arise from specific given condition genes pursue behavioral with reliable effects on personality typical developmental rules. According to the facultative calibration model, on the other hand, these two different types of models. Personality variation arises from the critical starting assumption for evolutionary genetic models. Given condition is that different behavioral for different trait levels, species typical developmental rules. That is that there might be alleles, I'll say just a little bit more about that organize these two different types of phenotypes of personality in such a way. The critical starting assumption for evolutionary genetic models to be lower on is that different alleles, and likewise there would be alleles that might reliably cause there might be to be higher alleles at a given gene level, and there might be other alleles organize the endophenotypes of personality in such a way that they reliably this assumption to be lower is a critical starting point for any model. And likewise, there would be alleles that might reliably cause an individual to be higher on of personality variation, and there might be other alleles that cause a more intermediate level. Just to give it a sort of example of how this is envisioned to work, this assumption is a critical starting point for any model evolutionary genetic analyze. One example would be fluctuating selection. This is where the optimal trait level function of genetic varies across either time or space, and just to give it a sort of example of how this is envisioned to work. So, for example, the optimal trait level for population one evolutionary genetic relatively low. One example will tend to increase the frequencies of allele number one. This is where the optimal trait levels varies decrease the frequencies of allele number space, and thereby maintains genetic variation. But for population, so for example, the optimal trait level for the optimal trait level might be relatively higher, and that will tend to increase the frequencies of allele number one, which causes low trait levels, and decrease the frequencies of allele number three. So you can see if you look across the populations, but for population two, the optimal distribution of trait level might be corresponding substantially higher, and that will tend to increase. And as such, we can see how allele number three natural selection can maintain multiple alleles and corresponding trait levels. So you can see if you look across the populations. You see a relatively this is sort of generally one example of how gene evolutionary genetic corresponding theorists envision personality. And as such, we can see how natural selection can maintain multiple alleles and corresponding trait levels. Common to all of these models is the idea that we should be looking for. This is sort of generally one example of how evolutionary higher or lower levels theorists envision personality variation being maintained by natural selection. But this is in contrast to, and the basic proposal common to all of these models is the idea that we should be looking for, which again genes that suggest that personality variation can arise from species typical evolved conditional rules of the form given condition X. But this is in contrast to, and these sorts of conditional rules are thought to implement the facultative calibration, which again suggests that personality variation can arise from species typical evolved conditional rules of the form given condition X. So these might be things like the cues might be things like conditional rules are thought to implement the physical trait calibration of behavioral phenotypes over the course of development in response to cues that have predicted optimal trait levels ancestrally. Don't be so aggressive. So these might be things like the cues might be things like phenotypic features, for instance, physical traits, or socioecologically fixed strategies by improving the functional match. So if you're between strategy and circumstance over evolutionary time. Don't be so aggressive. Under the evolutionary genetic models, small individuals can get the genes for high aggressiveness, and large individuals can get the genes for low aggressiveness, genetically fixed strategies by improving the functional match, a developmental rule between strategy and circumstance over evolutionary time. Behavioral strategy under the evolutionary genetic models, small individuals can get the genes for high aggressiveness. So the operative question, large individuals can get the genes for low theoretical level, producing essentially is whether adaptively patterned personality developmental rule arises through the effects of calibrating polymorphism strategy as predicted by evolutionary genetic over the course of development. Or mechanisms of the operative question, as predicted at a meta-theoretical level, developmental or is whether adaptively patterned personality fraction of the variance arises through the effects of specific polymorphic genes, as predicted by evolutionary genetic across sexes and samples. And this in turn supports mechanisms the idea that extraversion is facultatively calibrated to these other phenotypic features. When a surprisingly large fraction these effects of the were found to be largely independent of anywhere between 17 men's androgen receptor genotypes, which in turn are used against samples. And this in turn turn supports the idea that extraversion is facultatively calibrated to these other phenotypic
So the findings
features.
Instead support an integrative model.
These effects were found to be largely independent,
wherein
facultative
calibration
androgen receptor genotype,
and genetic polymorphisms,
which in turn argues against
concert,
although suggesting that
pleiotropy explanation
facultative calibration
to explain
explains a lot
those patterns
more
of correlation.
the variance, at least.
So the
given what we
findings
measured.
instead support an integrative model of extraversion's origins, wherein facultative calibration
again,
and
genetic
polymorphisms
there are two kind of foundational questions,
although
in the
suggesting that
personality
origins, and thus far we've just been focused on the first one,
at least.
Why do
what we
people
measured.
vary in their personality trait levels? But now I want to bring in as well this second question. Again,
the question of what causes
there are
distinct
two kind of
traits
foundational
to
questions in the
covary
study
inconsistent
of
patterns within
personality
individuals,
origins, and thus
rather
far
than
we've just
varying
been
independently.
focused on the first one.
Right. Why do people vary in their
And that's a
personality
topic
trait levels?
of
another recent
But now I
paper,
want to bring in
extending
as well this second
the ideas
question
talked
about previously.
The question of what causes distinct traits to
I don't think it's an
covary
overstatement
inconsistent patterns
to
within
assert
individuals,
that
rather than varying
personality
independently.
trait covariation forms the foundation for
And
most
that's a topic
personality research.
of another recent paper.
Indeed, one of the primary
extending
the ideas talked
accomplishments
about
of
previously.
personality psychology as a field has been to describe
I don't think
these
it's an
patterns
overstatement
of covariation
to
at
assert
various
that
sort of nested levels of
personality
specificity
trait
to come up
covariation
with
forms the
putatively
foundation
comprehensive
for most
personality
personality
taxonomies.
research. Indeed, one of the primary
accomplishments
despite
of
that
personality
fundamental
psychology as a
significance,
field,
much
been to
less
describe
attention
these
has been
patterns
paid
of covariation
to explaining the
at
origins
various
of
sort of
trait
nested levels of
covariation per
specificity
se.
to come up with
That is addressing the
putatively
question of why
comprehensive
distinct
personality
traits
taxonomies.
covary in consistent patterns within individuals, rather than varying
But
independently.
despite that fundamental significance, much
That's
less
not
attention
necessarily
has been
due
paid
to
a complete lack
explaining
of
the
interest in the
origins
question
of trait
as
covariation
multiple
per se.
explanations
That is addressing
for
the
trait
question of
covariation
why
have been
distinct
suggested or
traits
assumed.
covary in consistent
For instance,
patterns
many
within
personality
individuals,
psychologists
rather
subscribe
than
to the
varying
idea
independently. That trait covariation arises from
That's not necessarily due
integrated
to
latent
a complete lack of
psychological
interest in the
constructs
question
of some kind,
as
right, that are
multiple
inferred through the presence
explanations
of
for
trait covariation.
trait covariation have been suggested
And others
or
have
assumed.
pointed out that, for instance, many
Pleiotropy
personality
genes with effects
psychologists
on
subscribe
multiple
to the idea
aspects of psychology
that trait
and behavior
covariation
could also
arises from
produce,
trait covariation.
integrated latent psychological
But
constructs
even if
of
these
some kind,
proximate
right, that are
explanations are
inferred through the presence of
plausible
trait
in some
covariation,
form,
it still leaves
and others have
entirely
pointed
unclear
out that
the more fundamental
pleiotropy
genes with
which
effects
is
on
why
multiple
human nature would be
aspects of
structured
psychology and
such
behavior
that
could
distinct
also
traits
produce
covary
trait
consistently in the
covariation.
first place. But even if these proximate explanations are
And that's what
plausible
I'm
in some
attempting
form,
to address here with what
it still
I'm,
leaves entirely
calling the
unclear
common calibration
the more
theory,
fundamental issue
of trait
which is why
covariation.
human nature would be structured such that distinct
which is
traits
really
could
pretty
vary
straightforward
consistently
in the first place.
Let's say you have
Three potentially independent,
and that's what I'm
trait dimensions,
attempting to
traits
address
1,
here
2,
with
and
what
3.
I'm
calling the
Then
common
let's say you have
calibration
some
theory
ancestrally
of trait covariation.
recurrent Q, just to take for example physical
which is really
attractiveness.
pretty straightforward.
And let's further say, let's say you have this ancestrally recurrent
independent
Q predicts the optimal
traits
levels
1, 2,
along
and
all
3.
three of these traits.
Then let's say you have
then
some
each trait
dimension
ancestrally
independently
recurrent
evolved to be
Q,
facultatively
just to take for
calibrated
example physical
to the same
attractiveness.
input Q.
And let's
And
further
to the
say
extent that that's
that,
true,
this ancestrally recurrent
manifest
Q
trait covariation will
predicts the
naturally
optimal
emerge
levels
as a
along
function
all
of this
three
common
of these
calibration.
traits.
Well, then each trait dimension might independently evolve
This is
to
the
be
basic
facultatively calibrated
idea
to the same input
that
Q.
was tested
in
and to
the
the
current
extent
study.
that that's true. And here we're trying to
manifest
explain
trait
the covariation
that
that
naturally
occurs within
emerge
a
as a function
particular
of this common
interpersonal
calibration.
syndrome.
Right. I don't mean that in the clinical sense. I'm just using the
This
term
is the
to refer
basic
to a cluster of
idea
intercorrelated
that
traits,
was tested
in
could
the
refer
current
to it as
study.
a trait factor. And here we're trying to explain
So
here the traits
covariation
under
that occurs
analysis
within
are
a particular interpersonal
dimensions that have been
syndrome,
found to
right?
predict
I don't mean that
one
in
another
the
in the
clinical
extent.
sense. I'm just using the term to refer to a cluster of intercorrelated
negative
traits,
emotionality,
right? Could
extraversion,
refer to it as a trait
approach
factor.
and avoidance motivations, fear of rejection. So here the
Interpersonal
traits
trust,
under
attachment
analysis
styles,
are
and perceived social support. Dimensions
all
that have
these
been found to
distinct traits
predict one another
are
in the
intercorrelated.
extent
The question
of
here is
personality
why?
literature.
Empirically. Okay, so negative emotionality, extraversion, the model
and
being
avoidance
tested
in the
motivations,
current
fear of
study,
rejection suggests that
interpersonal
these
trust,
traits are
attachment styles,
intercorrelated because
and
each of them
perceived
are
social support.
facultatively
All of
calibrated
these distinct
in
traits
response to
are
phenotypic
intercorrelated
features.
The question here is
that
why.
determine an individual's
bargaining power in the social world, right?
bargaining power is
The
simply
model being
defined as
tested
kind of
in the
your
current
ability
study
to suggests that these traits are intercorrelated because each of them are facultatively calibrated
increase your value
in response
in the
to
social world and
phenotypic
also
features
your
that determine an individual's bargaining power in the social world. I will go
bargaining
into
power is simply
the
defined as kind of your ability
specific
to
sort of cost-benefit
generate
analyses
benefits for
along
others,
each
and
individual
also
trait
to
dimension,
inflict costs on others,
which would take forever.
which will increase your
Suffice it
value
to say
in the
that
social
this
world and also
model predicts
your
that
ability to get what you want out of it.
bargaining power will have positive calibrational effects
I will go
on
into
extraversion, approach motivation, comfort with
specific
closeness,
sort of cost-benefit
interpersonal
analyses
trust,
along
and
each
social
individual
support,
trait dimension,
and negative
which will take
calibrational
forever.
effects
On
on
emotionality,
emotionality,
say that this
fear of rejection,
model
avoidance
predicts
motivation,
that and attachment anxiety.
bargaining power will have positive calibrational effects on extraversion, approach motivation,
But there's one
comfort
more
with closeness, interpersonal
sort of piece to
trust,
this,
and perceived
and that's the
social
idea,
support, and
that
negative calibrational effects
in
on
order for
emotionality,
personality
fear of
traits
rejection,
to be
avoidance
calibrated
motivation,
to
and
an
attachment
individual's
anxiety.
overall bargaining power. The mind has to represent an internal estimate thereof.
But there's one more
sort of piece to this.
These
and
sorts
that's
of
the idea,
internal magnitudes
that
that can be
referenced by other
in
psychological
order for
mechanisms
personality
have been
traits
referred
to be
as
calibrated
internal regulatory
to
variables.
an individual's
And that's the
overall
way,
bargaining
we're
power.
conceptualizing
The mind has to
self-perceived
represent
bargaining
an
power,
internal estimate
in this
thereof.
study.
Right? To illustrate why this is
sort of necessary
these sorts
to
of
postulate,
internal magnitudes that can be referenced
this is because
by
bargaining
other psychological
power
mechanisms
is a joint
have been referred
function
to
of
as numerous
internal
distinct
regulatory
phenotypic
variables.
features.
And that's the way we're conceptualizing
For example, person A
self-perceived bargaining power
might be very
in this
low
study.
on physical
To illustrate
attractiveness,
why this is
so very
sort of
high on
necessary
physical
to postulate.
This is because bargaining power
is a joint
let's
function
say 8
out of 10
numerous
arbitrarily.
distinct phenotypic features. Right. But person B, for example,
might show
person
the
A,
inverse pattern, right? Being very
might be
high
very
on
low on
physical
physical
attractiveness,
but
very
low
high on physical
formidability.
Right.
But
Have
they
an
too,
overall,
at
the end of the day,
bargaining
have
power of
let's say
an
8 out of
overall
10
bargaining
arbitrarily.
power of 8 out of 10.
So to the extent
person
that
B
your overall bargaining power
might
is
show the
operative
inverse
factor,
factor, being
in
very high
calibrating
on
your
physical
optimal trait
attractiveness,
level,
the mind should
very
have
low on physical
an efficient
formidability.
system for determining.
But they too,
your overall
at the end of the day,
bargaining power,
have
representing that as an internal magnitude.
overall bargaining power of 8 out of 10.
So that's
So
one
to
more
the
piece,
extent that
to
your
the current
overall
study.
bargaining power is the operative factor in calibrating your optimal trait level.
So in study
the mind
3,
should have this overall
an
model,
efficient system
was
for
tested,
determining your
with
overall
methods
bargaining
very
power,
similar
representing
to
that as an
those from
internal
studies
magnitude.
1 and 2.
Subjects came into the
So that's
lab
one
and
more
first
piece to the
took a
current study.
questionnaire battery. Then we measured their actual physical strength and had them take
So in study 3,
pose for
this
photographs,
overall model
later to be rated
was tested
for physical attractiveness as
with
in
methods
study
very
2.
similar to
And the questionnaire
those from
battery
studies 1 and 2.
included a whole host
Subjects
of came into the
personality
lab
scales
and
of the
first
interpersonal traits,
took a questionnaire
battery.
battery. Then we
Previously,
measured their actual physical
also
strength
measures of
and had them
self-perceived
take
physical attractiveness
pose for photographs
and physical
later to be
formidability,
rated for
and
physical
also a measure
attractiveness
of
as in study 2.
self-perceived bargaining power.
And the questionnaire
Here, items
battery
taken
included
from
a whole
the
host
social
of comparison
personality
scales.
scales of the interpersonal traits,
where subjects just
evaluate
described
themselves
previously,
relative to others. Also
on
measures of
dimensions
self-perceived
like,
physical
inferior
attractiveness
to superior,
and physical formidability,
incompetent versus
and also a
competent.
measure
Basically,
of
are you better than other
self-perceived
people,
bargaining
in
power.
the social
Here,
world or
items
not?
taken from the social comparison scale. Right, where subjects just evaluate themselves
so I'll just
relative to
unpack
others, the sort of
on
final
dimensions
results
like,
here,
from this
inferior
study,
to superior,
which I think
incompetent
tell a
versus
pretty good
competent,
story.
right?
Okay, I'll just
Basically, are you
note
better
here
than other
the
people,
path
in the
coefficients
social world or
in the
not?
model for women are on the left within parentheses, and for men are
so
on
I'll
the
just
left within
unpack,
parentheses, and for women
the sort of final
on the
results
right within
here
parentheses.
from this study.
So the first thing to
which I
note
think
is
tell a
that
pretty good story.
people were,
Okay,
I'll just note here the
highly
path coefficients
accurate, really,
in the
assessing
model
their
for
own
women
phenotypic
are on the
features.
left within parentheses.
Actual physical
and
strength
for
was robustly
or for men are on the left within parentheses, and for women
other
right
rated
within
attractiveness
parentheses.
from the photos.
So
also
the first thing to note is
predictive
that
of
people
self-perceived
were
physical attractiveness.
highly, and among
accurate,
men
really,
only, but
in
not women,
assessing their own
both
phenotypic
measures of
features.
actual physical
Right.
strength. Actual physical
as would
strength
be expected,
was robustly
also
predictive
of self-perceived formidability,
which is
other rated attractiveness from the photos, also predictive of self-perceived.
And these
physical
measures of,
attractiveness.
and among
Specific
men
phenotypic
only, but not
features,
women,
both
also had
measures of
independent
actual physical strength
effects on
as would be
overall
expected,
self-perceived bargaining
also
power.
predictive.
Right, so
of
basically, this is how much better
which
do
is
you think you
component
are
of
and more
men's
competitive
attractiveness.
and so forth.
And among men,
And these measures
formidability had an
of
effect, but not among
specific
women, as would be
phenotypic
expected.
features also had independent
and this measure of
effects
on
overall
overall
self-perceived
self-perceived
bargaining
bargaining
power
power.
in turn.
So basically, this is
had
how much better you
radiating
think you are and more
independent
competitive
effects
and
on
so forth.
each of the interpersonal traits.
And among men,
and you'll note
you know,
that some of
formidability
these
had an
are
effect,
reverse
but not
scored,
among
for instance,
women, as would be
emotionality and
expected.
avoidance and fear of rejection.
And this measure of
attachment
overall
anxiety.
self-perceived bargaining power, in turn,
and
had radiating independent effects on each of the interpersonal
the effects of
trait
physical
dimensions.
strength and other rated
And you'll note
physical
that some of
attractiveness
these are reverse
in this
scored,
model
for instance, emotionality
had
and avoidance and
significant
fear of
indirect
rejection.
mediated effects all the way through the
attachment
model on
anxiety.
each of
the personality trait dimensions. Okay. So
And here, the evidence,
the effects of physical strength and other rated
all these different
physical attractiveness
are
in this
calibrated
model
ultimately
had
to
significant
variations in
indirect
physical
mediated
strength
effects
and,
all the way through the
actual,
model on each of
physical
the personality
attractiveness.
trait dimensions. So here,
the evidence,
this model proved a very good fit
broadly
to the
speaking,
data,
suggests that all these different interpersonal traits are calibrated ultimately
again,
to
all the indirect
variations in
effects were
physical
significant.
strength and actual
But this doesn't really
attractiveness. Provide a test of the core postulate of the common calibration.
This model
theory, right? It's
proved a very
consistent
good
with it.
fit to the data.
But the key question here is whether controlling
And,
for self-perceived bargaining power would
again,
reduce
all the
or
indirect
eliminate
effects
the
were
covariation occurring among these interpersonal traits.
But this doesn't
right, which is
really
what you should
provide
expect
a test of
if
the
their core
covariation
postulate
reflects that
of the
common
common
calibration
calibration theory, right? It's consistent with
So
it.
what happened?
But the key question here is whether controlling for self-perceived bargaining power would reduce
nearly
or
eliminated
eliminate
the
the
covariation
covariation
occurring
within this
among
cluster
these interpersonal
of
traits, right,
which
which
is what you
should
should
expect
expect
if their
So at the
covariation
zero order
reflects that
level,
common calibration.
the traits shared about 12%
what
of their
happened?
variance on
Well,
average
yes.
within each sex.
Controlling
But when
for
controlling
self-perceived
for
bargaining power,
self-perceived
nearly
bargaining
eliminated
the
covariation occurring
the
within
traits
this
shared only
cluster
3% of their variance
intercorrelated
among
trait
men,
dimensions.
and 5%
So at the zero
among
order
women,
level,
right? Amounting to a
the traits shared about
12% of their
covariation
variance
among men,
on average
and a
within each
58%
sex.
reduction
But when
in
controlling
covariation among
for
women.
self-perceived bargaining power,
So pretty strong support for the idea
traits shared only
that the
3%
reason
of their
these
variance
distinct
among
interpersonal
men,
traits covary
and 5%
is because
among women.
they're calibrated
Amounting
to
to
the
a
same
75%
phenotypic
reduction in
features.
covariation among men, and a 58% reduction in covariation
So in support of
among
study
women.
3,
The
so
results
pretty strong
support
support
the
for the
idea
idea
that
the reason that these distinct
wide
interpersonal
variety of
traits
interpersonal
covary
traits are
is
commonly
because they're
calibrated to
they're
the same
calibrated
input
to the
cues,
same
and that in turn
phenotypic
explains
features.
potentially why these interpersonal traits co-vary within
So in support of
individuals.
study 3,
The results
and
support
this
the idea
covariation
that,
is explained without making
a
reference
wide
to
variety of
unspecified
interpersonal traits are
latent
commonly
psychological
calibrated to the same
constructs,
input
right, but
cues,
rather actually
and that in turn
postulating
explains
a causal
potentially why
mechanism
these
by which
interpersonal
trait
traits
covariation
co-vary
arises.
within individuals.
and
This
so just to
covariation
summarize,
is
the
explained
empirical
without
findings
making
from studies
reference
1
to
through 3,
unspecified
1 through 3
latent psychological
studies 1 and
constructs,
2 address the
but rather
question of
actually
why people vary
postulating
in their
a
extraversion
causal
levels
mechanism by
and
which
found
trait
evidence for an
covariation
integrative model
arises.
wherein
Extraversion levels are calibrated to
so just to summarize,
phenotypic
the
features and
empirical
also
findings from
potentially
studies 1 through
influenced
3,
independently
1
by
through
specific
3,
gene
studies
polymorphisms.
1 and 2 address the question
And
of
study
why
3
people
addressed the
vary
question
in
of
their
why
extraversion
distinct
levels
traits
and found
co-vary
evidence
within
for an
individuals,
integrative model
and found evidence
wherein
extraversion
the
levels
common
are
calibration
calibrated
model,
to
wherein
phenotypic
trait
features
covariation
and also
arises from
potentially
calibration
influenced
to common
independently
input
by
cues.
specific gene polymorphisms. And study 3 addressed the question of why
Before,
distinct traits co-vary
finishing here,
within
I wanna go
individuals,
on to talking
and found
about
evidence
the
for
implications of these
the common
findings for
calibration
explaining,
model,
wherein
the heritability
trait covariation
of personality
arises
from
traits.
calibration to common input cues. It's been enshrined as the first law of behavioral genetics on the basis
Before,
of decades of
finishing here, I
twin
want to go
family
on to
and
talking
adoption
about
studies, the
that all
implications of
human
these
behavioral
findings
traits
for
are
explaining
heritable.
the
That is,
heritability
it is no longer
of
a finding
personality traits to report that a particular behavioral
It's been
or
enshrined
psychological
as
trait
the
is
first
heritable.
law of
It is.
behavioral genetics
You
on the
can
basis
publish
of
the finding if you find that it
decades
is not
of
heritable.
twin family and adoption studies.
And in
that
general,
all
human
uh,
behavioral traits.
the
are
finding
heritable.
is for major
That is,
personality
it is no
traits,
longer a
around
finding
half
to
of the
report
variance
that
in
a
personality
particular
traits are
behavioral or
correlated
psychological
with
trait
genetic
is heritable.
differences
It
in
is.
some way.
You can,
That
you
is,
can publish the
monozygotic
finding if you
twins
find
are
that it is
more
not
similar
heritable. traits than dizygotic
And
twins.
in general,
parcel that out.
the
in various
finding
ways.
is
for major personality traits, around half of the
So it's
variance,
possible,
as
in
has
personality
long been
traits, are
assumed
correlated
by
with
genetic differences
behavioral
in some way.
geneticists and evolutionary
that is,
geneticists,
monozygotic twins
that
are
specific
more
gene
similar on,
polymorphisms
traits than
will be
dizygotic
found to
twins, and
explain
you can,
this heritable
parcel that out in
variance in
various ways.
personality.
One example potentially being,
So it's
for
possible,
instance,
as has
effect of
long
an
been
androgen
assumed
receptor gene
by
polymorphism on
behavioral
extraversion.
geneticists
You
and
find enough
evolutionary
genes
geneticists
that have effects
that
on
specific
personality
gene
trait levels,
polymorphisms
then
will be
perhaps
found
you can
to
explain
this
this
heritable
heritable
variance
in
in
personality. One example
The
potentially
problem,
being,
for
the
instance,
tiny little
the
problem
effect
for
of
this
an androgen receptor
type
gene
of explanation
polymorphism
on extraversion. You
is
find
that,
enough genes that have effects on personality
since the mapping
trait
of the
levels,
human genome,
then perhaps you can explain
a host of
this heritable
genome-wide
variance in
association
personality.
studies appear to indicate
The problem,
that there are no
the
genotypes
tiny little problem
that reliably
for this
predict
personality
type of
traits
explanation
across individuals.
is that,
And this has been referred to
in-
as the
since,
missing
since,
heritability
since the mapping of the
problem.
human genome, a host
Lots
of
of heritable
genome-wide
variants,
association
but
studies
no
appear
genes
to
that
indicate
predict personality.
that
There are no genotypes that reliably
So it's
predict
interesting to note
personality
in that
traits across
context
individuals.
that the current studies found
this has
that
been referred to
interpersonal
as
traits,
the
a whole
missing
variety of
heritability
interpersonal
problem.
traits, appear to be
facultatively calibrated
Lots of heritable
to variations
variance,
in physical
but no
strength
genes
and
that
physical
predict
attractiveness.
personality.
which are known to be so it's interesting to note in that context,
along with
that the current studies found that interpersonal traits, a whole variety of interpersonal traits,
things like
appear to be facultatively calibrated to variations in physical strength and physical attractiveness, which are known to be, so it follows from this that any interpersonal traits that are calibrated in response to these other phenotypic with up to 90% will also exhibit heritability, things like even if there are no specific genes that influence the substrates of those personality traits in reliable ways. That is, there are no so it follows from this that any interpersonal traits that are calibrated nonetheless to these other phenotypic features traits will be heritable also exhibit to the extent that they're calibrated even if there are no specific genes that influence the substrates of those personality traits we've referred to as reactive heritability. That is, there are no genes for high extraversion and low extraversion. The idea here just being that a trait like extraversion being calibrated to be heritable to the extent that they're calibrated things like attractiveness, strength, and that's what intelligence and ability we've referred to as reactive heritability. Extraversion will show up as being heritable even if there are no genotypes that directly just being that a trait like extraversion being calibrated to these other heritable phenotypic features, things like attractiveness, strength, but that in turn just raises the question intelligence and ability of what explains the heritability of attractiveness. Extraversion will show up as being heritable even if there are no genotypes that directly genes existed for the that could reliably promote these reproductively beneficial traits. They would become species but that in turn just raises the question, things like what explains the heritability, attractiveness, all else equal, it's always better to be higher on these traits. But we know that natural selection can never reliably promote heritable variants reproductively beneficial traits. These sorts of fitness enhancing traits. They would become species typical, not least because mildly things like attractiveness, intelligence, are always introducing themselves into reproducing populations before natural selection can eliminate. But we know that natural selection can never completely in turn in the perpetual maintenance of noisy heritable variants in not least because traits like mildly harmful mutations are always introducing themselves into reproducing populations. So this also implies natural selection can eliminate any personality traits. And this results reactively heritable perpetual response to these other phenotypic noisy heritable variants should basically reflect in noisy traits like attractiveness and genetic mutations scattered across the human genome. Right. So this also implies then that indeed that any personality traits that are reactively heritable in response to these other phenotypic features, briefly over the findings from basically reflect a recently published study in the genetic mutations scattered across the human genome, which I think is pretty exciting. Okay. Here they're doing a genome-wide association study on thousands of individuals. And I'll just go using briefly over the findings from a recently published study in the Journal of Evolution. So first what they found, just to summarize, is that the heritability of a whole host of personality traits on thousands of was explained by very low frequency gene variants scattered across the entire genome as the measure of the level of genetic gene variants that are less than 1 or 2%. So first what they found, just to summarize, is that the heritability of a whole host of personality traits by definition was explained by very low frequency gene variants and not scattered across the entire genome by selection. Gene variants that are less than 1 or 2%. And secondly, they found, consistent with this general story, that genetic markers these are by definition likely genetic mutations, mutations that have arisen personality and not the effects were not random and noisy, selection, but rather directional. Individuals with higher mutation loads, consistent with this general story, had genetic markers of lower levels of extraversion-related traits, higher levels predicted personality traits. The effects were not random and noisy, but rather predicted by the sort of models I've been individuals with higher mutation loads. So just to put this all together, right, this suggests lower levels that the heritable variants, at least a lot of the higher levels of, for instance, interpersonal traits, can be explained ultimately by the sort of models I've been talking about. Of noisy genetic polymorphism. So just to put this all together, right, this suggests like physical attractiveness, physical strength, at least a lot of the heritable various components of intelligence, interpersonal traits, are dependent on the overall can be explained ultimately of the organism by overall phenotypic condition. Noisy genetic polymorphism is ultimately maintained by things like mutations. So traits like physical attractiveness, physical strength, mutation load, various components of evolutionary arms race are dependent on the overall phenotypic condition of the organism. And overall phenotypic condition, genotypes that predict high phenotypic condition, ultimately maintained by things like high attractiveness, selection balance. So any interpersonal load that are calibrated to variations in these arms race between condition-dependent features are ultimately going to reflect noisy genetic variation. The genotypes that predict high phenotypic condition. The specific genotypes that account for for at least this portion of the heritable variation. So any interpersonal traits dramatically that are calibrated to variations and never be common or condition-dependent features are ultimately going to reflect and measure noisy genetic variation. Right? The implication being that the specific genotypes that account for at least this portion of the heritable variation so much will vary dramatically across individuals and never be common or consistent enough of finding the genotypes that predict and measure psychological and behavioral traits. So I think this is a pretty important implication. I want to move on to discussion here, but just to sort of research effort and money is being poured. I think this research illustrates that cost-benefit trade-off theory, broadly speaking, is a productive framework for generating specific predictions. So I want to move on to discussion here, but just to sort of conclude. And I think this research illustrates the lack of conflict, cost-benefit trade-off theory, broadly speaking, and the hypothesis is a productive framework for generating where heritable personality variation can actually arise from species-typical adaptations. And I think the research illustrates the lack of conflict, important future directions for research, and the hypothesis first to replicate and extend the current findings where heritable personality variation can actually arise from species-typical adaptation and the reported effects. I acknowledge that empirically these findings are correlational. A couple of important future directions for research more first to replicate and extend the current findings of self-evaluation, superior methods, personality determination, and trait variation, the establishment of causality, and also research that importantly acknowledge that explicitly tests these for the reactive heritability of personality. Research that is determining constructs more comprehensive theoretical models of self-evaluation, by the heritability of personality determination and trait variation, and also research that importantly explicitly tests with that for the reactive heritability conclude, of personality. And thank you for determining whether giving me your attention. The heritability of personality is in fact mediated by the heritability of attractiveness, intelligence, and formidability. Okay, with that, I will conclude, and thank you for giving me your attention today. Appreciate it.